Hi, welcome back to the second half of the 13th and final session of History 3375, CIM, the Third World. This last portion is really a review preparing you for the final exam. Now, let me mention, if you are watching this on broadcast television, cable television, watching a DVD or a tape, I'm going to be making as many specific statements as I can to assist you for the exam. But since this course repeats any number of times over the years, just remember that the final authority on anything regarding the exams, their composition, potential questions, is the syllabus that you have as part of the course, because the course will change in some ways over the next few years. As it's being rebroadcast, those changes will be incorporated into the syllabus, but won't be reflected in the tape itself. So this will be a helpful guide, but if it disagrees in any way with something you see on your syllabus, it's always the syllabus that's correct, because the syllabus is always the latest version of the course. With that said, what I want to do is briefly go back through some things we covered at the beginning of the course, just to get everybody focused on, okay, what are the main ideas we covered here? And then that gives you a general guide into what can you expect on the final. We go to the first slide, and these are literally slides you saw at the beginning of the course. What were our objectives here? One thing was to provide you with some background history of the Third World. Generally speaking, we talked about the Third World, the importance of the West and its dominance of much of the Third World, reactions to that, the development of Third World nationalism, and we've looked at individual country histories of some Third World countries. Secondly, we wanted to talk about U.S. foreign policy, and I gave an extensive lecture on foreign policy, focused mostly on something I just finished talking about again in the first half of today's session, and that is the evolving American mission from the late 18th century all the way down to the early 21st century, and how that has been the guiding set of principles in U.S. foreign policy down through the centuries and recent decades. We've also looked at the history of the CIA as an institution, seeing how it evolved, seeing its characteristics, the dominance of covert operations through most of its history, factors that influenced the institution's development over time, the problems that it encountered in more recent decades. We focus much of the attention on the course, many of the lectures, on specific CIA interventions. What motivated the U.S. to intervene, what tactics were used, and why were the outcomes successful or unsuccessful. And ultimately, all of this is really designed to give you a focus on relationships between the United States and the Third World. What is this American mission? How is it conceived of in the second half of the 20th and beginning of the 21st centuries? How have Third World countries reacted to it? Because those reactions were often the triggering mechanisms for CIA intervention. Ultimately, the institution of the CIA serves as a mechanism for us to view and analyze U.S. foreign policy, to understand this mission and how the United States has tried to carry it out in the Third World in the face of challenges such as communism and Third World nationalism, and most recently, Islamism. Course requirements. This is basic stuff, but just a reminder so you know where your grade is coming from. You've already taken one exam, you'll be taking a second very soon. That's 80% of your grade. You've got reading assignments to do. You've been doing those. You have essays and other questions that comprise 20% of your grade. Now again, if you're watching this on tape, this may change. The syllabus says something different, then whatever the syllabus says is correct. But at this time, at this recording, this is the composition. 80% exams, 20% assignments. Grading criteria. Again, so you're aware when you're preparing for the final exam, again, what are we going to emphasize in terms of grading your exam? 40% analysis. Analysis means explaining how and why things happened, or comparative. If I ask you to compare three interventions in terms of U.S. motivation, etc., It needs to be comparative. You can't just say, well, the U.S. intervened here for economic reasons, military reasons over here, strategic reasons over there. There's got to be a comparison. Well, in these three cases, in two of them, the economic issue was very important, and the third economic issue wasn't important at all. It was ideology. It's got to be comparative. Okay? You've got to show differences or similarities. You can't just individually, separately list three distinct cases. You've got to compare. If it's analytical, you have to explain. Now, well, why didn't the CIA prepare itself, or why was the CIA unable to provide adequate warning, sufficient warning, against 9/11? What are some of the factors? You have to explain that. Whether it's problems between the CIA and the FBI, problems in intelligence analysis in general, et cetera, you need to talk about the various whys of that question when you answer it. Factual information. You need enough factual information to support your argument. That's another 40% of the grade. If you're going to make a statement like, well, one of the problems in addressing the threat of terrorism to domestic institutions in the United States was the conflict between the FBI and the CIA. Okay, give me examples. Well, it dates all the way back to the time of Hoover. He didn't want to see the CIA created, but then more recently, problems like the Aldrich Ames investigation, et cetera, some factual examples that demonstrate that that isn't just a statement on your part, that you actually know some of the facts that back it up. And then composition. Is the answer logical? Logical, beginning, middle, and an end. Now, if you're going to talk about comparing three cases, well, there's a logical way to go through it to talk about, if it asks, well, let's compare the historical backgrounds, let's compare U.S. motivations, let's talk about tactics, let's talk about reasons why the outcomes were successful or unsuccessful. There is a logical structure. Okay, that's the way I covered it, that's the way you can cover it in the answer. That's composition. We're not going to put an enormous amount of emphasis on spelling, grammar, although if it's really bad, yeah, if it creates a problem for the person grading the exam in terms of understanding what you're doing and what you're trying to say, then it's an issue. But the main thing you have to be concerned about is composing a logical essay, laying it out in a logical fashion that someone can follow. That's our concern in terms of your writing ability, is your ability to structure a logical argument and lay it out clearly. In terms of the readings that you've been doing and will have to draw upon for the final exam, what you need is a general grasp of the material, rather than falling into the trap of trying to absorb a huge amount of detail. If you can summarize the main points, if you read an essay, if you read an entire book, if you can sit down and briefly, in a couple of pages, summarize what are the main points in the work, then you have the information that you need. That's the kind of information you'll be asked either in homework assignments or in the exam to provide, is what's the main thrust, the main argument in this essay, this book. You shouldn't have, even if you're reading a book of, let's say, 300 pages, and I'm just purely hypothetical, you shouldn't have 20 pages of notes, okay, on a 300-page book. That's way too much. 5, 6, maybe 7 pages, if we're taking handwritten notes. God knows how big you write. But in other words, you want to capture the main arguments, the main facts. You don't want an excruciatingly detailed account of that book or that essay. In terms of preparing for the exam, focus on the summary points, the key points that are made usually at the end of each major session. Now, at the end of each of the cases of intervention, I go back over, okay, what were U.S. motivations, tactics, explain the outcome. I go over those key points. That's where you need to start. You need to start with, okay, what were the key things that he wanted to emphasize in this lecture? When you've got those, then you can start anticipating questions, because I build the questions out of those points. I look at, okay, what were the main points I was making in this set of lectures? All right, those are the things that are going to be emphasized in the questions that I write. When you've got a reasonable idea that, well, look at here are 3 or 4, and I'm going to go over some of these areas that he's likely to ask a question on, then you should prepare an outline for yourself. What are the main things that I would put in an answer? One side of a sheet of paper, just write down, these are the main things. So you're prepared. You've thought through the kind of answer you would give. Leave that piece of information at home. Not meant to be brought to the exam, but it's great preparation. You may be able to do it in your head. Some people can do that. You can just sit down and say, okay, I can sort through, and I know how I would answer the question. These are the main things that I would talk about. A lot of people, you want to write it down. If you're prepared, that's one of the keys to doing well on the exam. If you come to the exam and only then start thinking, well, how am I going to answer this kind of question? You're going to spend a lot of time. You should think through again before you actually answer the question. But still, if you have to start from scratch once you get to the exam, because you haven't even thought about how you'd answer any question, you've just got a lot of notes in your head. That's going to be hard to do. What kinds of questions? Well, you already know from the midterm. I'll emphasize it again. I emphasized it at the very beginning of the course. Broad and general questions. My goal is to encompass as much of the course in a limited number of questions. Whether it's 2 questions, 3 questions, look on the syllabus. That'll tell you how many were being asked. Whatever it is, I try to capture as much of the material from either the first half or the second half of the course, depending on the exam, in a couple of questions. So breadth is an emphasis. And as I suggested earlier, in terms of what is emphasized in terms of grading, the questions emphasize how and why did things happen, and comparative approaches. Compare these interventions. Again, the classic question I often ask. You've got the homework assignments. The identifications, which hopefully you've already done before successfully, but I'm going to go through it again. Who or what is this thing? How is it tied to the document? 3 sentences should be sufficient to answer the IDs. And again, this may change on your syllabus. You'll have to check it if you're watching this as a tape, as a broadcast in the future. But right now, that's how you answer those IDs. If you're answering an essay for homework, you're really being asked to summarize what are the main points of the article. About 5 paragraphs, because if you write 2-sentence paragraphs, that's probably not enough. And again, this may change again, check the syllabus, but if you're being asked to do an essay for homework, in the current version, it should take at least 5 paragraphs to answer that question, which is basically summarize whatever article or essay you've read. Okay, now, the critical part. What does the final cover? And my answer is check the syllabus. And again, I have to say this because this is a course that will be repeated a number of times, rebroadcast. The material covered on the midterm versus the final will always be indicated on the syllabus. It'll say, well, the midterm covers session 1 to whatever, 6, 7. And then the syllabus will also tell you the final will cover sessions, let's say 8 to 13 or 7 to 13, but it varies because the broadcast schedule varies. The fact is that we try to avoid including on the midterm specifically a session that will only be broadcast a few days before the exam. It doesn't give the viewer a lot of time to prepare for that session, and there could always be a technical glitch, and maybe the session won't be broadcast. But the broadcast schedule changes, so what's covered on the midterm versus the final varies from semester to semester. So that's why I say check the syllabus, okay? That's the only accurate indication what's going to be on the midterm versus the final exam, and especially now, for you watching this, the final exam. The main focus for the final is always the cases, the lectures covered since the midterm. That's the main focus, okay? But check the syllabus. the main emphasis is always the second half of the course. Whatever the syllabus says in terms of those sessions, whether it's from session 6, session 7, session 8, whatever, that's the main emphasis. With a large but. You need a working knowledge of earlier cases for comparison. Now, what does that mean? Simply this. If I'm asking a comparative question, I might include one of the intervention cases from the first half of the course. If I do, it would be in a multiple comparison. So as long as you had a basic knowledge of, okay, I know what the historical background was in sort of summary form. I know basically what the U.S. motivation was. I know basically what the tactics were. I know a little bit, and I certainly know what the outcome was and have some idea why it occurred. That's sufficient. In other words, you're not going to see from the first half of the course a question focused on one or two cases from the first half. That won't happen, but I might throw in a case and say, look, I want you to compare these 4, these 3, and one of them is from the earlier in the course. I would not expect the same level of detail or precision on that case, but sometimes using one of those earlier cases is helpful in terms of the structure of the question. So you should run through the notes. Focus on the second half, of course. Focus on what the syllabus tells you are the sessions you're responsible for. Then go back and simply read through the earlier cases, just so in case there is a reference to an earlier intervention, you'll have at least some knowledge of that earlier intervention, just to refresh your memory. But spend 90% of your time on the material that the syllabus says you're responsible for the final exam. Now, what are not so much possible questions, but areas? Okay? And I'll give you the following. One possibility is a question on historical background. In other words, a question that just says, tell me about the historical events leading to the crisis in country X. Examples: Vietnam, Chile. I might ask questions and say, well, explain how Vietnam's own history with China and the colonial intervention by the French set the stage for the war between Vietnam and the United States in the 1960s and 70s. And what I'm really asking for is give me the historical background stuff that I gave you in Vietnam in the first half of that session. And the focus here is not that you can remember every detail, but that you can establish a pattern here. Vietnamese nationalism, fighting against the Chinese. A couple of examples. Okay? The French intervention, violating Vietnamese nationalism. French changes to Vietnamese society. Okay? Commercialization of agriculture. The salt monopoly. Further antagonizing the Vietnamese, creating a discontented Vietnamese middle class and increasingly landless peasantry. How those discontents are translated into various movements opposing French colonialism, such as the nationalist movement and the communist movement. Their struggles to try to rid themselves of the French, leading up to the conflict in the late 40s and early 50s and ending with the Geneva Conference that resolved it and divided Vietnam north and south, but left the issue of the future of the South open. That, in a nutshell, is the answer. In Chile, the struggle to expand the inclusion of the population in the benefits of society, economic, social, political. From the time of Balmaceda in 1891, struggle between two elements of the elite, the president on the one side and much of the elite on the other, over how state revenues were being divided. Struggle in the 1920s and 30s by communists, socialists, and moderates, representing the organized working class and the middle class to gain access to power, their success through the Popular Front, and then the creation of the sort of historic compromise that excluded the peasantry from participation, the breakdown of that compromise in the 50s and 60s, and finally with the Allende government in the early 70s, as peasants are included, and Allende begins to create a socialist society, incorporating the poor, the peasantry, through land redistribution, income redistribution, etc., setting off a deep-seated conflict within Chilean society, and of course, antagonizing the United States by taking this showcase for the Alliance for Progress and turning it into at least an evolving socialist society. All of that created the grounds for the U.S. intervention. That in a nutshell, okay? And those are the kinds of cases that I tend, if I'm going to ask a historical question, to ask about, where there's a clear pattern of evolving conflict. Just as in the first half when we talked about Iran, there's a case where you can really follow the triadal relationship. It's those cases where you can most clearly see an evolving conflict. Those are the ones I'd be most likely to ask about. So that's one possibility. If I ask a historical background question, I would never ask it from the material that you're responsible for the midterm. Okay? It would always be one of the cases from the second half. The next likely, or possible, I shouldn't say likely, but possible question is a comparative question about interventions. The points to be made or asked about compare the historical background, the causes of intervention, the tactics, the outcomes. I might ask you to compare 2. I might ask you to compare 3, rarely, but I might throw in 4 cases. That's an awful lot. If it's 3 that I ask you about, I probably would drop the historical background part and only ask you about the other issues of motivation, tactics, outcomes. Okay? Because you have to be realistic in terms of how many elements can you possibly compare in the time you have for the exam. Obviously, with each of these, if you are being asked about historical background, you're not going to write 5 pages in historical background. Right? You're going to have to do a few paragraphs summarizing, like I just did with Vietnam and Chile, sort of the highlights. Because if you're comparing even 2 cases, you still have to get onto U.S. motivations, you got to get onto tactics, and you got to get onto outcomes. So obviously, with historical background, it has to be, somewhat summary. You don't want to write, as I said, 5 pages of historical background when you've got the other issues to deal with. Also, when you're talking about outcomes, of course, what you'd be expected to do is go through that list of factors that we covered with each intervention and compare them. So that gives you a good deal to do, even if we're doing 3 cases and you've dropped historical background, just with those other factors, that's plenty, particularly since you have to go through the various elements influencing outcomes, whether it's, political support, political mobilization, etc. And you have to focus on comparison. If you're looking at cases, motivations. Are there similar motivations? There may well be. Many times there are multiple motivations. But in one case, you may well be able to argue, you may say, gee, there was economic motivation in both cases, but in one case, it's far more important. It is the dominant issue. Whereas in the other case, there's an economic motivation, but ideological factors seem as important. Or you may be dealing with a case, and we suggested this with Vietnam, for example, where you're really dealing with this sort of all-encompassing mission, that the Americans see this instance as a challenge to their modernization mission, that they have to go out and not only fight communism, but they also have to reshape and modernize the society, build a nation. And on the other hand, in terms of economic motivations, in terms of immediate economic motivations, no, that would not be something that plays a major role in Vietnam. But you do need to be comparative and show, are they similar, are they different? What are some of the important nuances here? Maybe it's economic motivation in both cases, but maybe it's a different kind. Maybe in one case it's the U.S. defending what it sees as its overall economic interests, and in another case it's the U.S. defending a particular corporation at the behest of that corporation or that group of interests. So that can vary. But it does need to be comparative at every level. You have to show, are the motivations similar or different? They may be, but you got to show, are they? Are they similar or different? And you need to think about this, because oftentimes when people start writing an answer like this, they just say, well, I just got to get it done. So, well, these are entirely different in terms of their motivation, and then you start writing, of course, economics are important in both cases. Well, then I guess the first sentence is no longer operational. So that's why you need to be thinking through answers before you sit down to take the exam. So you can think about, well, if I was called upon to compare Chile and Nicaragua and, I don't know, Vietnam, how would I compare that in terms of U.S. motivations? Or tactics, There's a lot of paramilitary stuff in Vietnam. There's a huge amount of it. Whereas in Chile, while there's some paramilitary, it's mostly political and economic embargo, etc. Yeah, you need to think through those kinds of similarities or differences. And again, as I said, probably a maximum of 3 cases. In some rare instance, if I felt there was a particular important example to throw in, I might ask for another case. But generally, 3 is the maximum, because that's about as much as you can usually handle in the exam. Third possibility, the age of terror. This really isn't, one that I'm going to ask you comparisons on. I'm not going to, it really would be impossible. The lectures aren't structured that way, nor are the issues structured in such a way as that, well, how are you going to compare this to Nicaragua or Vietnam or Chile? Yeah. But there is, of course, a real possibility they'll ask you a question just on the age of terror. What are the main elements? Well, you do get some of similar elements here in the sense that you do need to talk about historical background. Where did Islamism evolve from? What's Wahhabism? Where did it come from? How does it compare with the sort of nationalist, secular nationalist approaches in terms of political movements in the Middle East? What gave rise to the increasing influence of Islamism in the second half of the 20th century? What are some of the basic conflicts that at least Islamists see between the West and the Middle East, and particularly between the U.S. and Islamic societies? In terms of the specifics of the rise of Al-Qaeda and the terrorist groups, what was CIA involvement in Afghanistan, and how is that linked to movements like Al-Qaeda and bin Laden? What is the relationship? Why America slept? What were the problems with intelligence gathering and analysis, particularly with the CIA, but also the FBI? Why was Al-Qaeda able to pull off 9/11 after the earlier successful attack on the World Trade Center? What was some of the major problems? And finally, as a part of the same question, which is really about intelligence in the age of terror, what are the critical problems that led to the mistakes in terms of analyzing the threat from Iraq, and specifically the question of weapons of mass destruction? That's your third possibility. A question that would essentially, however it might be asked, would include those major elements in it. And it might be a question like, although I'm not saying this, as well, take this because this is a hint, but something about, discuss the problems of intelligence gathering and the defense of the United States against terrorist threats in the age of terror, blah, blah, talk about the historical background, etc. Well, that's what it's really asking, lay out these key points. And finally, the omnibus question that nobody wants to see. This would be the fourth possibility. Discuss the American mission over the past century, what its goals and approaches were, how it applied to the Third World, what Third World reactions were, and how did CIA interventions play a role in the process of trying to carry out the American mission in the face of various forms of resistance in the Third World, from Third World nationalism to Marxism to Islamism. Okay, so how do you answer it? First of all, you take the first part of the lecture I gave in this session today, which sort of outlines the American mission, sort of its evolution, and particularly over the past 100 years, consumerism, the idea of modernization theory, productivity improvement, etc. You can talk about examples of Third World nationalism and their evolution and their resistance. And where would you get that kind of information from? Simple. Any number of the cases that we've looked at, when we've looked at the history of these individual countries, you can say, well, yeah, I know you talked about Third World nationalism, but that was way back at the beginning of the course. And I thought we weren't emphasizing that. I'm not. So where do you get examples of Third World nationalism and resistance? Allende's Chile, okay? The Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the communists in Vietnam, etc. Islamism. These would be ideal examples. What did they do? Well, they were nationalizing stuff. They were trying to create socialist societies, the antithesis of what the United States wanted to see created. Islamism, of course, rejects secularism, materialism, Western cultural influences. Okay? So that's where you'd get the examples. And then, okay, how does the CIA fit into this as an agent that attempts to propel the American mission forward? Well, through its interventions. That it is motivated in its various interventions by specific threats to the American mission, whether it's nationalization of American economic interests, alliances with communist countries, attempts to create socialist societies. Its motivations for intervention in each case would help establish that third point. What's the role of the CIA to counteract these specific challenges to the American mission? So it's really a combination of the first half of today's session and those points that we covered there, along with information from the cases, especially from the second half, although you can certainly draw on the first half of the course if you want to, that will help talk about challenges to the mission and the CIA as an element, particularly in undermining states that challenge the American mission, or in the case of Vietnam, of course, trying to pursue the American mission by building a Western-like society and nation in South Vietnam, while, of course, at the same time fighting off the communist challenge. So that's that answer in a nutshell. You've got the four possibilities. Okay? That encompasses all of the main points from the second half of the course. You could see a historical background question. I almost always, although almost always isn't always, ask a comparative intervention question. There is the possibility of an Age of Terror question, which is really a summary of the lecture on the Age of Terror, particularly the points that I just gave to you. And then finally, the possibility, if I'm in a rare mood, of an omnibus question, which I think if you have studied for the other three, then all you really need to do to prepare yourself for that fourth question, well, that fourth possibility of a question like that, is think through the things that I've just talked about. You don't need to restudy for that question. I would simply sit down and say, okay, now that I've prepared for the other three and I feel comfortable that I could cover those areas, based on what I know, what are the pieces that I would put down in answering this question? It shouldn't require a separate, whereas with like the age of terror, you need to go and review the notes and look at the key points. With the interventions, you need to go through the various cases and review those. But once you've done all that, you really have all the elements you'd need to answer this other possibility. Okay? So this is the last one you have to prepare for, and I would do it just based upon, okay, now, with all my reviewing of the other stuff, here are the pieces I would pick out of that to answer this last possibility. Finally, again, because this will be rebroadcast, and rebroadcast, there's always the possibility that I'll invent other possible questions. But if I do, they'll appear again on the syllabus. Here's another sample. Here's another possibility. Something else occurred to me over the last year or so as another way to structure a question. If I did that in a future iteration of this course when it's rebroadcast, I would put that on the syllabus so you'd have, you would not be taken unawares. But right now, for this session, those are the four possibilities. If anything is added, it would be on your syllabus. Okay? I want to thank all of you for your participation in the course. I hope it's been informative and enlightening. And most of all, good luck on the final exam. Thanks.